If you are here right now, it is not by accident, and it is not because you were casually searching for answers. Something far deeper has already begun to shift within you. Long before your conscious mind noticed, an internal process was set in motion, quietly loosening the grip of old patterns, outdated reactions and identities that no longer reflect who you are becoming. What you are experiencing is not confusion or loss of direction. It is the unmistakable signal that your old self is being gently yet decisively powered down. For a long time, you may have lived as an observer of your own life, watching opportunities pass, repeating emotional cycles, and feeling as though reality was happening to you rather than responding through you. This observer state often feels safe because it is familiar, even when it is painful. The mind clings to what it knows, even when what it knows is limitation, scarcity, or emotional exhaustion. Yet transformation never begins in comfort. It begins in awareness, and awareness is exactly what is being activated now. This moment marks a transition from passive observation into conscious participation. Your nervous system, your emotional body, and your attention are being recalibrated to support a higher frequency of experience. This does not mean bypassing fear, doubt, or resistance. It means learning how to move through them without allowing them to define your future. Manifestation, at its core, is not about forcing reality to comply with desire. It is about becoming internally coherent enough that reality has no choice but to respond differently. As you continue listening, you are not being asked to believe blindly or imagine unreal outcomes. You are being guided to recognize how subtle shifts in attention, emotion, and identity can collapse old timelines and open entirely new ones. The old you was built for survival. What emerges next is designed for creation. This is where the disconnection ends and conscious alignment begins. The observer state and the silent patterns that sustain it. For much of life, existence unfolds through repetition rather than intention. Days appear different on the surface, yet the emotional responses beneath them remain strikingly similar. This repetition is not coincidence. It is the signature of the observer state, a condition in which awareness watches reality without actively shaping it. In this state, the mind becomes skilled at predicting outcomes based on memory, and the body learns to respond before the present moment has fully arrived. What feels like intuition is often habit, and what feels like fate is frequently familiarity disguised as inevitability. The observer state forms gradually, reinforced by experiences that taught caution, restraint, or emotional self-protection. Over time, the nervous system learns which emotions are safe to feel and which ones must be suppressed or avoided. Attention narrows, focusing primarily on preventing discomfort rather than allowing expansion. In this condition, even positive desires can feel distant or unreal, not because they are unattainable, but because the internal state required to sustain them has not yet become familiar. Within this pattern, frequency is not an abstract concept. It is expressed through posture, breathing, internal dialogue, and the subtle emotional tone carried throughout the day. A body conditioned by stress or disappointment does not easily stabilize elevated emotional states, such as trust, openness, or anticipation. Instead, it returns to what it knows, creating a loop in which thoughts reinforce emotions and emotions validate thoughts. The observer remains convinced that reality dictates internal experience, unaware that the internal state is quietly shaping perception itself. What makes this phase difficult to recognize is its sense of normalcy. Nothing feels overtly wrong, yet nothing feels deeply alive. There may be moments of inspiration followed by swift regression into old emotional climates. This fluctuation is not failure. It is the nervous system testing unfamiliar territory before retreating to safety. The old self is not malicious or broken. It is efficient at maintaining continuity, even when that continuity limits growth. As awareness deepens, subtle cracks appear in this structure. Reactions that once felt automatic begin to feel slightly delayed. Emotional responses lose some of their intensity. The mind starts questioning its own assumptions, not through effort, but through fatigue with repetition. This is the beginning of disengagement from the observer role. The old frequency weakens not through confrontation, but through loss of relevance. In these moments, the present feels unusually quiet. The familiar internal commentary softens, creating space that can feel unsettling at first. Without constant mental narration, identity feels temporarily undefined. This undefined space is often mistaken for emptiness, yet it is better understood as potential. It is the pause between patterns, where awareness is no longer fully invested in the past, but has not yet committed to a new configuration. Here, manifestation begins to shift from concept to experience. Reality does not immediately transform outwardly, but perception changes inwardly. Subtle opportunities register more clearly. Emotional reactions soften before solidifying. The individual no longer stands entirely outside their own life. The observer state loosens its grip, and participation becomes possible, not through force but through coherence. The old self fades, not because it is rejected, but because it no longer matches the frequency being established. Emotional frequency and the invisible architecture of reality. Beneath every visible outcome lies an emotional architecture that quietly determines what feels possible, permissible, or unreachable. This structure is not built through logic alone, but through repeated emotional states that condition the body to expect certain results and reject others. Emotional frequency is the language through which the inner world communicates with the outer one, translating internal coherence or fragmentation into lived experience. It is not an abstract vibration, but a measurable pattern of physiological readiness, perception, and response. When emotional frequency remains anchored to past experiences, the present moment becomes filtered through memory rather than awareness. Joy may appear briefly, yet it struggles to stabilize if the body has learned to associate safety with vigilance or restraint. In such cases, elevated emotional states feel unnatural, fleeting, or even threatening. The system responds by returning to familiar emotional climates, reinforcing an internal environment that mirrors the past instead of inviting the new. This internal architecture is maintained not by conscious choice, but by emotional memory stored within the nervous system. Each unresolved experience leaves an imprint, shaping posture, breath, and expectation. Over time, these imprints form a baseline state that feels like self, even though it is merely a conditioned response. The old identity is not defined by who one is, but by what the body has rehearsed most consistently. As awareness expands, these emotional structures begin to reveal themselves through contrast. Moments of calm, clarity, or openness feel noticeably different, not because they are intense, but because they lack friction. In these states, perception widens and the environment appears more responsive. Conversations flow differently. Timing feels less forced. Choices emerge with less internal resistance. This shift is not coincidence. It reflects a temporary alignment between emotional state and present awareness. The challenge arises when the system attempts to sustain this unfamiliar coherence. Without pressure or effort, the old emotional architecture may reassert itself, pulling attention back into known patterns. This return does not signal regression, but integration in progress. The body is recalibrating, learning that stability does not require contraction. Each exposure to a coherent emotional state weakens the dominance of the old frequency and strengthens the new one through repetition. As this process unfolds, reality begins responding in subtler ways. Opportunities present themselves without struggle. Insights arise spontaneously rather than through analysis. The sense of separation between internal intention and external circumstance softens. Manifestation ceases to feel like an act of will and becomes a natural consequence of alignment. The individual no longer seeks to change reality, but notices how reality reorganizes itself around a shifted internal state. The invisible architecture of emotional frequency operates continuously regardless of belief. It does not require affirmation or visualization to function. It responds to coherence, not desire. As the old emotional framework loses relevance, it dissolves through lack of reinforcement. What remains is not an inflated sense of control, but a grounded presence capable of sustaining new patterns. In this space, creation no longer feels distant. It feels inevitable because the internal structure finally supports it. The dissolution of the old identity and the emergence of coherence. Identity is often mistaken for personality, history, or accumulated roles, yet it is far more fluid than it appears. At its core, identity is a pattern of emotional responses, attentional habits, and expectations rehearsed over time, until they feel permanent. The old identity persists not because it is true, but because it has been repeated with consistency. It is sustained by reactions that once served a purpose, even if that purpose no longer exists. As internal frequency shifts, this identity begins to loosen. The thoughts that once arrived automatically now appear with less urgency. Emotional reactions that previously dominated entire days pass through more quickly, leaving less residue behind. This change can feel disorienting, as if a familiar internal reference point is slowly fading. What once defined self no longer carries the same authority, and without it the mind searches for something solid to hold on to. This phase often carries a subtle sense of uncertainty, not rooted in fear, but in the absence of the old emotional anchors. Without the constant reinforcement of past narratives, identity enters a transitional state. The system is no longer governed by reflexive survival patterns, yet it has not fully stabilized into a new configuration. This in-between space is where coherence begins forming, even if it initially feels like groundlessness. Coherence does not announce itself with intensity. It emerges quietly through alignment between thought, emotion, and perception. There is less internal contradiction, less resistance between what is sensed and what is interpreted. Decisions arise with clarity rather than urgency. The body responds with ease instead of tension. This internal synchronization signals that the old identity is no longer directing experience. The dissolution of the old self does not involve erasing memory or denying past experiences. Those experiences remain, but they lose their emotional charge. They are no longer used as templates for the present moment. The nervous system gradually learns that safety does not depend on maintaining familiar reactions. With each moment of coherent presence, the body records a new reference point, one that does not rely on defense or anticipation. As coherence strengthens, perception itself begins to reorganize. Situations that once triggered immediate judgment now invite curiosity. Interactions feel less personal and more informational. Challenges are perceived as dynamic rather than fixed. This shift does not remove difficulty from life, but it alters the internal posture from which difficulty is met. The individual no longer reacts from a rehearsed identity, but responds from present awareness. This emerging state creates a natural recalibration of priorities. What once felt urgent may lose its grip, while subtle impulses toward growth or alignment gain clarity. The sense of striving diminishes, replaced by a steady orientation toward resonance. Manifestation in this context is no longer about acquiring outcomes, but about maintaining coherence long enough for reality to reorganize around it. The old identity fades through irrelevance, not rejection. It dissolves because it cannot survive without emotional reinforcement. What remains is not emptiness, but a more spacious sense of self, capable of holding complexity without fragmentation. In this coherence, creation feels less like effort and more like participation. Reality no longer feels separate from the self, because the internal state finally mirrors the present moment, rather than the past. Alignment in motion, and the natural reorganization of experience. When coherence becomes more stable, life begins to feel as though it is moving with you rather than against you. This shift is subtle at first, often recognized only in hindsight, through moments that unfold with unexpected ease or timing that feels unusually precise. Alignment is not an external reward for inner work. It is the natural consequence of an internal state no longer fragmented by conflicting impulses. As the old identity dissolves, experience reorganizes itself without force. In this aligned state, action no longer emerges from pressure or urgency. Decisions arise from a quieter place, guided by clarity rather than emotional reactivity. The body feels less compelled to anticipate outcomes, allowing attention to remain present. This presence alters how situations are interpreted. Instead of scanning for threat or validation, awareness engages with what is actually occurring. This alone changes the trajectory of experience. The environment responds to alignment through resonance. Conversations unfold with fewer misunderstandings. Opportunities appear without aggressive pursuit. Obstacles still exist, yet they no longer feel personal or absolute. They are perceived as temporary configurations rather than defining barriers. This does not suggest that reality becomes effortless, but that effort is no longer driven by internal conflict. Energy once consumed by resistance becomes available for creation. This phase often brings a heightened sensitivity to subtle signals. Timing feels more noticeable. Intuition sharpens, not as mystical insight, but as an increased capacity to register information previously ignored. When attention is not fragmented by internal noise, perception expands. Small details carry greater meaning. Choices feel informed rather than reactive. Life begins to communicate through nuance instead of disruption. As alignment deepens, the relationship with uncertainty changes. The need for control diminishes because internal stability no longer depends on predictable outcomes. The system becomes adaptable, capable of adjusting without collapse. This flexibility allows new pathways to emerge organically. Manifestation in this context is not about directing specific results, but about sustaining a state that naturally invites favorable configurations. Old patterns may still surface at times, especially under stress or fatigue. Their appearance does not undo alignment, it reveals remaining areas of integration. Each resurfacing offers information rather than regression. The difference now lies in response. The aligned state recognizes these patterns without becoming them. Awareness remains intact, preventing the old identity from reclaiming dominance. Over time, alignment becomes less noticeable because it feels natural. What once required effort now feels intuitive. The sense of being separate from life softens. Experience unfolds as a continuous interaction rather than a series of obstacles to overcome. The individual no longer feels like a passive observer or a forceful controller, but an active participant within a responsive system. In this state, miracles are redefined. They are no longer rare disruptions of reality, but shifts in perception that reveal what was always possible. The extraordinary becomes accessible through coherence rather than struggle. As internal alignment stabilizes, reality mirrors it with increasing consistency. The old self, built for survival, has fully disengaged. What remains is a presence capable of sustaining creation, grounded not in effort, but in resonance with the unfolding moment. What has unfolded throughout this journey is not a promise of instant transformation, but a recognition of something far more profound. Change does not arrive from the outside, and it does not require force, struggle, or constant effort. It begins the moment internal coherence replaces internal conflict. The old self, built from repetition, protection, and emotional memory, fades naturally when it is no longer reinforced. Nothing is taken away. Nothing is lost. What dissolves simply no longer serves the frequency you are stabilizing. The idea of manifestation often becomes distorted by urgency, as if reality must be persuaded or convinced. Yet what becomes clear here is that reality responds most powerfully when persuasion ends. When attention, emotion, and perception align, experience reorganizes without resistance. The external world does not change because it is commanded to do so, but because the internal reference point from which it is perceived has shifted. This is not mystical escapism. It is coherence expressed through lived experience. The quiet power of this process lies in its subtlety. There is no dramatic collapse of the old identity, no single moment of arrival. Instead, there is a steady loosening of patterns that once felt absolute. Reactions soften, choices clarify, presence expands. Over time, what once required effort becomes natural, and what once felt unreachable begins to appear with simplicity. The extraordinary no longer feels distant because it is no longer approached from fragmentation. This is the essence of real transformation, not becoming someone else, but releasing the internal noise that obscured who you were capable of being all along. As coherence deepens, life no longer feels like something to chase or escape. It becomes something you move with, respond to, and participate in consciously. The old self does not disappear in defeat. It steps aside, having completed its role. What remains is awareness grounded enough to create without strain, and present enough to recognize meaning as it unfolds. If this message resonated, it is worth pausing for a moment and noticing what is different inside you right now. Not what you think should be different, but what has subtly shifted beneath the surface. Is there more stillness than before? Less urgency? A sense of space where there was once pressure? These quiet changes often go unnoticed, yet they are the earliest indicators that a deeper realignment is already underway. Here is an important question to carry with you as this video comes to an end. If the version of you shaped by old reactions is no longer in control, what kind of reality becomes possible when coherence takes its place? This channel exists for those moments of transition when old frameworks no longer fit and new clarity is beginning to form. If you want to continue exploring how awareness, frequency, and alignment reshape experience, consider subscribing to the channel. New long-form videos are designed to support this process gently and consistently without pressure or sensationalism. As the screen changes, another video is waiting for you. It continues this conversation from a deeper angle, building on the same energetic foundation you are now stabilizing. Allow your attention to move there naturally and let the process unfold at its own pace. This is not about rushing forward. It is about staying present long enough for reality to meet you where you are becoming.